few months ago, there were 39 letters in my snail mailbox from an insurance company. 39. I almost never talk about the meta of being a therapist on this platform. There are therapists and therapist business consultants who talk about this all the time, and I follow quite a few of them. But because of something that happened in my own practice recently, I thought it might be helpful to give you a more personal look at why a mental health provider might tell you, I don't take insurance. Because from the client side, that can sound pretty simple. You have insurance, the therapist provides healthcare. Why wouldn't the therapist take your insurance? Well, let me tell you how I got here. Therapy is actually an encore career for me. I entered the field following a significant life change when I needed to build a career while providing for 3 young, closely spaced children. I've now been working and growing in this profession for going on 20 years. For about 15 of those years, I participated with all of the major insurance companies. And I don't only know insurance from the private practice therapist side. I've managed programs, including intensive outpatient programs, and I've worked in residential substance use disorder treatment. I've supervised utilization review, which is the process of communicating with insurance companies about a patient's treatment, establishing medical necessity, and essentially making the case for why the person needs the level and duration of care we're recommending. I've worked in emergency psychiatry, where a significant percentage of the people we saw were under-resourced or uninsured. I've managed care for people receiving private pay concierge services. And interestingly, I've worked on the insurance side. I worked for a major managed care organization as the clinician doing the initial authorizations for inpatient mental health and substance use disorder treatment. So when I say I understand this system, I don't mean that I've just submitted some claims. I've sat in a lot of the chairs. Throughout all of that, I've maintained a private practice. Sometimes it was larger and sometimes smaller, depending on what other position I held at the time. Then, a few months ago, I went to my mailbox, actual snail mail, and waiting for me were 39 letters from Aetna. 39. They concerned a client I had treated and continue to treat. Aetna had retroactively terminated that client's insurance coverage and was demanding repayment for the claims it had previously processed and paid. Here's the important part. When I provided those services, I had verified the insurance. The policy was in force and showed active coverage. I provided the treatment. I submitted the claims. Aetna processed the claims and paid me. Then the policy was retroactively terminated, and Aetna wanted its money back. Nearly $4,000. For a large healthcare organization, $4,000 maybe a rounding error. For a small private practice, $4,000 is real money. I immediately contacted Aetna. I disputed the recoupment, and I asked them to pause while I tried to figure out what had happened. They acknowledged the correspondence, but didn't provide the information I was asking for, and the recoupment process continued. I contacted the Texas Department of Insurance. Eventually, I learned that because this particular insurance plan was self-funded by the employer, the Texas Department of Insurance didn't have jurisdiction over the matter. Meanwhile, Aetna was recouping the money from payments for other Aetna clients. And I want you to understand what that looks like from the therapist chair. I would sit down with an Aetna client. I would provide the hour of clinical care. I would document it. I would plan for their session and work with their treatment plan. I would submit the claim, and the money for that session would be applied to the nearly $4,000 Aetna said I owed them. Then I would see another Aetna client, same thing, and another. These aren't the client whose coverage had been retroactively terminated. These were other people with active policies, receiving services in real time. From my perspective as the small business owner providing these services, I was working without receiving revenue for that work because it was being used to repay claims that had been approved and paid months earlier. That was my tipping point. Not because insurance had been particularly easy before that. It hadn't. For 15 years, I'd had accepted reimbursement rates that were substantially lower than my private pay rate. I had dealt with administrative requirements, delayed claims, denials, resubmissions, credentialing, changing policies, all the other things that come with participating on insurance panels. And here's something people outside of the profession may not know. Becoming more experienced, more specialized, and more educated doesn't necessarily translate into higher reimbursement. Low reimbursement isn't just an issue of insufficient income either. It becomes a capacity issue. If the reimbursement for each clinical hour is low, one of the few ways a therapist can make the economics of private practice work is to provide more clinical hours. That can mean seeing more clients per day and more clients per week. Not necessarily because that's the caseload the therapist believes allows them to do their best work, because that's the caseload required to make their personal numbers work. And there's a limit to how many hours of focused, present clinical work a human being can sustainably provide. So now we're not just talking about therapist compensation. We're talking about conditions that can accelerate burnout and compassion fatigue, and ultimately make it harder for therapists to be the clinicians they want to be for the people across from them. That's a capacity problem. And I think we make a mistake when we treat those two as separate conversations. What should therapists be paid, and how do we prevent therapist burnout? They're connected. I completed a doctorate. My psychotherapy reimbursement didn't suddenly increase because I had invested in substantially more education. I stayed on insurance panels anyway, partly because for a long time, the cost-benefit analysis still worked for my life and practice. Insurance networks helped me keep my caseload full while I was doing other kinds of professional work and professional work roles. But there was another reason too. I believed and still believe that access to mental health and substance use disorder treatment matters. There was a part of me that felt participating with insurance was one way I contributed to that access. And that's what makes this complicated. Because when a therapist stops taking insurance, it doesn't necessarily mean that therapist stopped caring whether people can afford therapy. Sometimes it means the economics of continuing to provide therapy that way stopped working. A therapy practice has to remain financially viable for the therapist to continue providing therapy. And there are other costs that don't appear on a claim form. Administrative time is a cost. Fighting claims is a cost. Unpredictable revenue is a cost. Providing clinical work while wondering whether money already paid to you can be taken back months later is a cost. And clinician capacity is a resource too. We talk a lot about therapist burnout as though it is purely an emotional problem. Take better care of yourself, have boundaries, don't schedule too many clients. Those things matter, but burnout also has structural contributors. You can't mindfulness your way out of a business model that no longer works. Eventually, I had to apply the same kind of resource management thinking to my own practice that I talk about in so many other contexts. What is this system costing? What is it providing? Is the current structure sustainable? And does it still make sense for this stage of my career and life? For me, that answer changed a few months ago. So after approximately 15 years of participating with insurance companies, I've made the decision that for the remainder of my clinical career, my practice will be private pay. That decision has consequences. I understand that it means more people will not be able to work with me. I don't dismiss that or pretend it doesn't matter, but access cannot be sustained entirely by asking individual clinicians to absorb the financial and administrative problems of a much larger healthcare system. Psychotherapy is also a profession in which reimbursement has historically been low relative to the education, responsibility, administrative burden, and emotional labor involved. And it is worth examining how we culturally and economically value care work, particular work performed in professions that have historically been dominated by women. That's a much larger conversation for another day. But I wanted to tell you this story because the next time you hear a therapist say, "I'm private pay, I don't take insurance," I want you to know there may be considerably more behind that sentence than you can see from the waiting room. Sometimes it isn't about greed. Sometimes it isn't about exclusivity. Sometimes it isn't about privilege. And sometimes it isn't because the therapist doesn't care about access. Sometimes somebody finally looked at the whole equation: the money, the administrative burden, the uncertainty, the capacity required, and whether the model was actually sustainable.